The confluence of theology and science is going to begin to meet up over a spiritual experience.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring psychedelics and spirituality. My guest is Dr. Rick Strassman, a associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico. He is the author of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, a doctor's revolutionary research into the biology of near-death and mystical experience. He has also written Inner Paths to Outer Space and, most recently, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, a new science of spiritual revelation in the Hebrew Scriptures. He's also recently written a novel, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. Welcome, Rick.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You are in a unique position as an individual who both has had extensive spiritual practice, both in terms of Zen Buddhism and also Jewish studies, and you've been a researcher of psychedelic drugs. There are very few people who can wear both hats.
Once I decided I wanted to study the biological bases of spiritual experiences by doing research into the effects of psychedelic drugs, I also wanted firsthand experience with a religious practice and a discipline. So in my early 20s, I established a long-term relationship with the Zen Buddhist community when I was 22 or so. Yeah. And I was a member in good standing for 24 years. I was ordained as a lay Buddhist. I was married at the monastery. I helped establish an affiliated group and helped to run that in Sacramento for years. So, yeah, I wanted to learn to meditate. I wanted to see what Buddhist scriptures had to say about spirituality. Because if I was going to look at the biology of spiritual states, I needed to understand the spiritual states as well as the biology.
Well, and Buddhism would seem to me to be a natural choice, given that the famous book, The Psychedelic Experience by Leary, Alpert, and Metzner, uses the Tibetan Book of the Dead as sort of a roadmap for understanding the LSD experience.
I think the conflation of Eastern religion and the psychedelic movement subculture is a very interesting one. It's assumed automatically that there's a relationship between the psychedelic drug effect and Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. And I think that's because they appeared on the West Coast and the East Coast basically around the same time. So that was a time of change, which meant abandoning your past.
It was an era in the 1960s where people used to say, never trust anyone over 30.
Right. And Judaism was certainly over 30 years old in Christianity. But, Buddhism was brand new, and it was quite appealing to those who were rejecting their father's tradition.
Yeah.
So within that context, I learned some transcendental meditation in college. I think I was 20. One of my roommates said, it's really great for headaches. So I said, well, I get headaches. So yeah. And it helped with my headaches. And it was an altered state. It was mild. It was appealing. I didn't see a lot of overlap with a high dose, psychedelic experience, but it seemed like there was potential there. And we started a class on Hinduism and the Bhagavad Gita. I didn't find that kind of religion very appealing intellectually. It was more faith-based belief. Faith, just kind of turning yourself over. So I was more attracted to the intellectual rigor of Buddhism and took a class in college on Indian Buddhism, which is quite philosophical.
Yeah.
So I went off to medical school and got depressed and dropped out and ended up at the monastery and learned Zen studies and practice.
And I gather you found that meditation was a healthy practice. You stuck with it for 20 years.
Right. I still practice. I'm not really a member of the organization, but I loved the practice. I loved the practice itself. Sitting cross-legged, breathing, just being aware, and the striving. The active passivity. You could really relax and really apply yourself at the same time. And in our, in the community I studied with, there was an emphasis on enlightenment, on Kensho, like the breakthrough. So you were trained to sit as relaxed in a manner as possible, but to be aiming towards this incredibly profound culmination of all experience at the same time. The enlightened state. And it required a lot of work. So after a while, it didn't seem like enlightenment was in the cards, but it really helped me study. I could really, shut things out. And I could enjoy the study. It, resonated with me because I wasn't resisting it emotionally or physically. Yeah, so once I went back to medical school, I was a studying machine and also was, doing a lot of meditation. So I moved back to California to train in psychiatry and to be closer to the head temple and helped establish that that affiliate group. One of my interests in relating psychedelics and Buddhism stems from conversations that I had with the young monks back in the 70s. I would ask all of them when I got them alone, have you ever taken LSD? And 90% said yes. And I said, well, how important was that LSD experience in you becoming a monk? And they said it was critical, it was crucial. So I said, that supports, the idea that there is some kind of relationship between the psychedelic and the spiritual life.
Well, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, about Zen meditation in particular, is that the emphasis is on the ordinary, not on seeking visions and extraordinary states of consciousness at all, but I think, as they say, carrying water and chopping wood.
Right. Well, it kind of depends on your teacher. Some of the teachers emphasized being as attentive as possible to everything that you're doing. But, for the organization I studied under, that kind of attention, that kind of contentment and comfort with the world were only preliminaries, to going, for the gold, which was the enlightened state. Because if it's, if it is an enlightened state, it sticks with you. So even though you push hard, you don't have to push, so hard the next time. I don't think.
Well, wouldn't you say that with regard to meditation or with regard to psychedelics, that there's a difference between an enlightened state and a visionary state?
Yeah. It's depending on your definition of these things. What is a mystical state? What's a religious experience? What's a spiritual state? Yeah. So in the Prophetic States book, DMT and the Soul of the Prophecy, I begin the book, by defining my terms.
Yeah.
What is consciousness? What is an altered state? What's religious? What's spiritual? Spiritual tends to be, thoughts, feelings, which are quite elevated. They're, valued and they're rare, and they inspire. So a spiritual experience would be one in which those kinds of characteristics of the actual state itself are dominant. Then religious experience is a spiritual experience which occurs within some kind of religious setting, like enlightenment, let's say, in a Buddhist one. So you can also divide them up in a way that I do in the Prophetic States book between unitive mystical, which is the white light. You're merged with the source of all being. It's empty of content, no feeling, no ideas, no thinking, no words. So that's, the unitive mystical state. And the other category could be called the interactive relational state, where you are in a very altered state, but you're interacting as a discrete personality with other discrete sources of information and will. So, depending on the context, some traditions value the unitive mystical state, and some value the interactive relational one.
Well, you went through something of I'm going to call it a conversion experience, but maybe it's the opposite of that. You had an experience that caused you to turn away from a Buddhist practice that had been going on for decades and move back to the study of biblical Judaism.
Yeah, it was kind of a complicated set of dynamics. When we were all younger, the junior monks and I would talk about psychedelics and my interest in them and studying them. And they were quite encouraging. They would say, yeah, that makes sense according to my LSD trip in college. It, was quite consistent. And, those are some good questions. Let's go deeper. Yeah, but once I started, doing the research, it became a little more controversial within the community to discuss in the same breath, drugs and Buddhism. So, that was kind of, disappointing. And, but in a way, it wasn't, because it's a, religious organization. It isn't an academic center.
Right.
So there's certain, priorities in one which aren't operative in the other. Yeah, so I, wanted to, carry on an academic, discourse on, the notion. And, they were saying, no, that's not how it works here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, it's been great. I've really enjoyed working with you. Yeah. So I then got interested in Judaism, Jewish thought, Jewish ideas. For one, function was like another spiritual home. I'd been, part of that community for quite a long time. So I thought, well, I was raised Jewish. I'm born Jewish. What's going on within, my own tradition. So, that was, one of the reasons that I returned to Jewish, thinking. On the other, and the one that, got me hooked, is that once I started to read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it seemed as if the experience of prophetic, consciousness, was a really good fit for the DMT experience, because most of our volunteers had interactive relational, kinds of states. Excuse me. So Buddhism, with its emphasis on enlightenment and the unitive mystical state, couldn't quite contain the data of what we were seeing. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's all about people speaking with spiritual entities, either God or angels.
Yes.
So that seemed pretty interesting. And the more I learned about the Bible, could understand it better, the more this idea of the prophetic state started to clarify itself as one that would be at least phenomenologically similar to the DMT effect, and would provide an effective springboard for bridging spiritual dialogue and biological dialogue.
Of course, I think, as you point out in your book, there isn't any particular evidence that the ancient Hebrew prophets were using substances, entheogens or psychedelics of any kind.
No, there really isn't any evidence. And if you take into account the existence of endogenous DMT, it may be a human neurotransmitter.
Mm-hmm.
So it may go up and down depending.
Sure.
And influence you in a way that kind of occurs on occasions prophecy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I learned one interesting fact reading your book, and that is, I should have known it, I suppose, but that according to the rabbinical tradition, prophecies ended when the Second Temple was rebuilt by Cyrus the Great, as I recall.
Well, so the concept of the end of prophecy seems to me as much a political question as either a biological or a spiritual one.
Mm-hmm.
I think it occurred around the time it did because a lot of people were claiming to be the Messiah in the Second Temple period.
Mm-hmm.
And they claimed to be able to exclaim prophetic utterances, and their books were almost legitimate as the ones in the canon. So the rabbi said we can't have all these people saying they're Messiah and adding on to the canon. So let's standardize it, which meant that the speeches that these people were giving were not prophetic because prophecy is over, the canon's closed, there's no more prophetic utterances which constitute scripture.
Mm-hmm. And I think there was this saying, it's much better to be a rabbi than a prophet.
Much better. Yeah, you'd be harangued as a prophet.
Uh-huh.
Compared to to or the ones proto-shamans from the West who want to be shamans. It's their calling and they study. Or Buddhists who want to be enlightened. They say, "I want to be enlightened." You won't find a prophet saying, "I want to be a prophet." It's an extremely discomforting position, because of the news that you often carry. The standing up, to authority and, to tradition, the scorn that is heaped on you, by the public and, the ruling class. Yeah. So it isn't a thing that, that anyone would choose. The one interesting, story is, Jeremiah had a attendant, what was his name? It'll come to me. His name was Baruch.
Mm-hmm.
And Baruch was a faithful attendant of Jeremiah, and he really wanted to be a prophet. He was so angry he wasn't wasn't experiencing communication with God.
If I remember correctly, he was like a scribe writing down what Jeremiah had said. He was like a literary executioner or something.
Right? Yeah. Well. So God speaks through Jeremiah to Baruch and tells him, "You're asking too much, Baruch. Isn't it enough to, be the scribe? Yeah, you're asking too much."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if you want to be a prophet, oftentimes it won't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't want to be, like, Moses just complained, bitterly, like a first couple 3 calls, from God to become, the deliverer.
Well, I just finished 3 monologues that have been released on this channel about Peter Kingsley's book called Catafalque. Its subtitle is Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. And basically he argues that Jung was a prophet and that Jung struggled against it his whole life. He didn't want to be called a prophet. He wanted to be thought of as a scientist, not a prophet.
Uh-huh.
And Peter Kingsley makes the point that as you've just said, no prophet wants to be a prophet. They all struggle against it.
Right. Well, they struggle against it, and they try to refuse it when it's handed to them in the first place. Yeah. Well, this brings up the question of true prophecy and false prophecy. And there are criteria. One thing that might be helpful is you were raising the notion of Jung being a prophet.
Yes.
And one of the ways that's usually defined is predicting the future. Seeing into the future in an accurate sort of manner.
And Peter Kingsley makes a point to saying that's not prophecy at all. A true prophet is one who sees the present.
Well, that's also true. But in the case of seeing into the future, the predictive elements,
yes,
that is a function of the translation of the Hebrew word for prophet into the Greek, which was the first non-Hebrew translation.
Yeah,
so the Hebrew word is navi.
Navi.
Yeah, which comes from the Hebrew root nuv or nava or something. I mean, it can come from any one of 3 or 4 roots. But the Greeks, with their interest in divination, being able to predict the future, translated it prophetes, which means seeing into the future, or proto-seeing.
But even the word divination does suggest, like prophet, there's a divine element.
Right, and the application of that specific divine element is seeing into the future, divining. So one could call Jung prophetic in that way, if one defined being a prophet as foretelling the future. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of prophets whose predictions never came true, or who just spoke about other things. He or she never predicted the future. But their importance is the teaching at that moment and in that place.
Well, the ancient Hebrew prophets, many of them warned, it was sort of like, if you don't change your ways, terrible destruction is going to befall us. And then there was the Babylonian exile and terrible destruction that did occur. And as you point out in your book, the prophets lost respect because for all their prophecy, they weren't able to prevent that terrible destruction of the first temple and the whole Hebrew nation.
I know. Well, look at Jeremiah. I mean, talk about morose. I mean, he is so lachrymose. Yeah, there's a few inspiring verses in Jeremiah, especially Jeremiah 17:14, which I refer to a lot in the Joseph Levy book as healing me.
Your novel.
Yeah, my novel. It's just calling upon God to save you and to heal you according to His benchmarks, rather than your own. Like I want my arm to start hurting, to stop hurting, or whatever. That may not be God's idea of healing you. And there's a couple other inspiring things that he says, but mostly it's if you don't change your ways, the temple's going to fall, Jerusalem's going to fall, you're going to be exiled. And cooperate with the Babylonians. Don't fight them. Better to live and fight another day, and to maintain the culture and the religion. And the Jews called him a traitor, and the Babylonians. It was quite a complicated thing for Jeremiah. Yeah, but the city didn't repent. It's an interesting thing, the whole idea of reward and punishment in the Bible, which is one of the reasons most secular, humanist, educated, Westerners say reward and punishment. That's so patriarchal. It's so cause and effect.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, the Bible seems like a horrible book. If you read it carefully, it's full of all sorts of stories of murder and betrayal and even genocide.
Well, there's a lot in the Hebrew Bible that's pretty grim. But I would say the majority is pretty inspiring. One of the things about, the punishment is that the text spells out a particular, system of cause and effect. Like, if you do this, then this will follow. And, that's Buddhist. Everything comes about, now from what happened before. If you do this, then certain consequences are automatic.
Yeah.
Because of the laws of nature and moral laws, which could be seen as emanating from the same source and thus permanent and eternal. So it spells out things like proper behavior, like if you move your neighbor's boundary line, that's bad.
Yeah.
And understand the golden rule and practice it, and believe in one God that you serve. And they're saying if you believe those things and you do those things, then things will go well with you, which spells out a certain manual in a way of living your life according to a divinely inspired kind of tradition.
Well, one of the themes that runs right through your book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, is the idea of God. And the idea of accepting, even from a scientific perspective or a theological perspective, the idea that prophecy is not generated by humans, it's generated by God. God is the source of prophecy.
Right. Well, I spent a lot of time in the early chapters of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, taking the reader by the hand from the end of the DMT book to going smack dab into the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
So one of the early chapters is about God. So the first word in the Hebrew Bible, or the second, is God. In the beginning, God created.
Right.
And for most people, that's just a stumbling block. What's God? Who's God? I don't believe in God. So.
And yet the idea of God is pretty well established in the whole Western culture.
Yeah, it's impossible to eradicate. It's probably the most enduring idea there is. So, either believing in God or not believing in God or wondering about God. Yeah, I got my first, toehold to understanding God through Buddhism, actually. And it had to do with karma, cause and effect. Cause and effect is eternal. But the thing about, cause and effect is that things are created, exist, and then pass away. So the law of karma, had to be that way too. It had to, be created, exists now, and is going to end at some point because it's a thing, it's a unit. It isn't an empty, it's empty of an essence, but it's created. It's a thing.
Well, this concept of emptiness is very important in Buddhism. It's not a concept you find in Judaism, to my knowledge.
Well, not within the text, not within the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
The rabbis allude to it, and the Kabbalists, the Zohar, the mystical branch of Buddhism, of Judaism.
Yes.
It emphasizes the importance of, merging with the unitive mystical state. But there are no unitive mystical states in the entire Hebrew Bible.
Right.
It's all interactive and relational. Yeah, so I, began to think about, karma as existing and then, not existing. If the law of, cause and effect, says everything, is created, exists, and goes away, then that applies to the law of karma. So I thought, well, who created karma and who sustains karma? So I started thinking, what created karma and what sustains karma? So that was an inkling of the existence of God. And the other was, the nature of cause and effect. Cause and effect encourages us, to do certain things and discourages us from, doing other things.
Right.
Like, if you're always angry, your health is going to suffer. And that's, cause and effect. So I thought, well, isn't that interesting that, cause and effect is steering us in a certain direction. There are certain values that are inherent in the system of cause and effect. So I thought, well, whose values are those? And and that began to let me think about the mind of God, what God wants from us. It's so in a way, God both created and sustains a system of karma, which encourages the virtues, discourages the vices, and emanates, from the same source as the laws of nature.
And you suggest, if I remember correctly, that for people who have been through a psychedelic experience, or many of them, and are looking for a spiritual tradition which would be consistent with these very intense experiences that they've had, that it would be good to find an experience, find a tradition which is compatible with their cultural upbringing, so that they don't have dissonance around that. And also, you emphasize the importance of a spiritual tradition that acknowledges a deity.
Right. Those are both important. The first because of the nature of most people's experiences on psychedelic drugs. They're usually interactive and relational. They're struggling with stuff, they're talking to stuff, they're walking around.
Yeah.
It isn't unitive mystical, even though that might be their implicit goal.
But often in my experience with psychedelics, and LSD in particular, it's like you have this relational part and you're struggling, and then all of a sudden there's like a breakthrough into another realm where you just let go of ego and you see everything from a completely different perspective where you're non-attached.
Right. And I think, an interactive relational guidebook or, model to fall back on when you're struggling with the relations in that state, could be quite helpful.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of experience, or there's a lot of examples in, prophetic visions of the prophet being confused, being afraid. They can't understand what's going on. What's the information that you're trying to exchange with me or to, provide. And there's a lot of guideposts for how to negotiate dealing with entities, with angels. Mm-hmm. Like you plead, you pray, you praise, you ask direct questions, you ask for help. Mm. Yeah, so those are all spelled out in the text, and they've been tried and true for a few 1,000-year-old prophetic tradition of being able to extract information from a DMT-like state.
Mm-hmm. So the visionary experiences reported of prophets are akin to the visionary experiences of psychedelic users.
Well, especially the phenomenology. Mm-hmm. I compared the DMT state very carefully with what I conjured up as a prophetic state. Mm-hmm. Like we were talking earlier, most people think of prophecy as foretelling. Yeah. And that isn't always the case in prophetic figure in the text. Yeah. Sarah spoke to God and was never foretelling.
As a parapsychologist, I make the distinction between precognition, which is seeing the future, and prophecy. I don't think they're at all the same.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I define the prophetic state as any spiritual experience described in the text. Okay. Could be visions, could be voices, might be inspiration, might be strength that just descends on somebody. Mm-hmm. Poetry, being skilled in crafts. Mm-hmm. All those things can be spiritual gifts.
Well, what I found particularly interesting in your book is that then you draw upon the medieval Jewish scholars who were schooled in Aristotelian philosophy, but were still devout religious believers, certainly believers in God, and they tried to use their philosophy to integrate it, to develop a new theology for Judaism.
Once I finished making the comparison between the visions, the phenomenology of the two states, it seemed clear to me that the DMT effect was not a prophetic experience. Mm-hmm. So I said, I thought, what's the difference? Well, there were two differences. One was the level of development of interactions. Most of the volunteers, all the DMT volunteers, didn't know how to extract as much information as they could. Mm-hmm. They were startled. They didn't have the language. They didn't have the technique. They didn't have the understanding of, who are they confronting? Who are they meeting up with? What can they provide them? What's the best way to, obtain that information? So I developed a new category, which was relatedness, which then, moved things over in favor of the complexity and the uniqueness of the prophetic state. The balance was completely on.
You also point out that they had schools of prophecy in the ancient times in the First Temple in Israel, and communities of prophets. It wasn't just some guy on his own out in the desert.
There are a couple of references, to bands of prophets. Mm-hmm. Samuel used to lead a band of prophets. And there's a school of prophets, which was led by both Elijah and Elisha, his disciple. So they were studying prophecy as a school. Yep. So they must have been studying and practicing. Yeah. Miracles occurred in those schools. Elisha sweetening, a bitter well of water. Mm. The cruises of oil, 100, cruises of oil from, one pot. Uh-huh. Yeah. It must have been an interesting community, those schools.
I actually do recall reading a study at one time that related the school of prophecy to the witch of Endor in the Bible, that there was a community of witches in this location very nearby the school of prophecy, and that they had interaction.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, well, that's a great story, the Witch of Endor, who, conjures up the ghost of Samuel.
Yes.
Yeah, Saul wants to find out what's going to happen to him. And Samuel is in the ground. The spirit comes up and says, "You'll be joining me soon." Yeah, that's a sad story. There are schools of prophets, but what they did is a mystery. Mm-hmm. There's a story of Elijah, going in, to the desert, to die. Mm-hmm. And he just, lays down. But it's hard to say, what he was doing. I wouldn't think he, wanted to die.
He was supposedly carried up to heaven in a chariot.
Right.
While he was still alive.
Yeah. He, went to the same cave that Moses went to when he saw God's glory. So I don't think he was, ready. So there must have been, something that he was doing. Mm-hmm. At the very least, he stopped eating and he stopped drinking, and was then visited by an angel who said, "Eat and drink." So that may have been caused from the stress of the starvation.
Yeah. And I can well imagine that as a scientist, you're looking at what are the effects of fasting or starvation on the biology that might produce visionary experiences.
Well, my study of the philosophers from the Middle Ages led me to wonder what's the mechanism of the prophetic experience. Mm-hmm. And it had to do with the influence of God's efflux, overflow, emanation, onto the imagination and the intellect, which were the two ways that the Aristotelians divided the mind. And it seemed as if those techniques stimulated the imagination. For example, fasting, if it raises DMT levels, would stimulate the imagination. And by imagination, I don't mean made up. I mean it's perceptual, sensory and emotional. You can counter it, with the intellect, which is just abstract. It's only ideas. The imagination is everything but ideas. So, they believed that the efflux from God, the prophetic overflow, which stimulated prophecy in the prophet, stimulated the imagination, which had visions and voices, feelings, mm-hmm. and then the intellect could extract the information because it knew what it was seeing and knew how to communicate it.
The imagination is like a conduit between the intellect and the divine.
Well, I think it's a conduit. You also might look at it as a screen, a projection screen. Like on that screen, you see and you feel the information that's trying to be downloaded, and then you extract that information with your intellect. One of the philosophers, Maimonides, believed that prophecy was the perfection of the intellect and the imagination. Like in the full prophet, those two faculties were at their highest. Mm-hmm. And you could improve your intellect by study. But there wasn't much room for growth with the imagination, which is where the psychedelics may play a role in stimulating the imagination, which is, I think, their primary effect. The content of the DMT experience was not that profound. The interrelatedness wasn't as good as in the prophetic state, or as fulsome. and the information content was even less so. So the information content of prophecy, or perhaps of any religious experience, depends on your intellect, your rational faculty. Like how do you interpret what just happened? And what just happened is displayed or played out or channeled through the imagination.
Did you ever have the opportunity to administer DMT to people who were advanced meditative practitioners or advanced students of any particular religious discipline?
In the DMT study, we had a volunteer who was a former Buddhist monk. And his experiences weren't that big. He could still move. He could still think. So he supported in my theory that there's a increase of DMT in naturally occurring spirituality. If that's the case, then maybe giving extra DMT wouldn't have that much of an effect.
This reminds me of the story I think you cite in your book of Ram Dass, who met his guru Neem Karoli Baba in India and gave him a hit of acid to see what would happen. And the guru said, sure, I'll take it, and swallowed it, and there was no change whatsoever.
Well, that story was key in my understanding of endogenous, DMT and the, non-drug related state or caused state. But that whole, the whole, theory was kind of blown out of the water by one guy in our study. Just kind of an average Joe. He was a bartender. He liked to swim. I think he was in school at the community college. Just an everyday, regular guy. He never meditated like a day in his life. We gave him a full dose of DMT, and he said, "Have you given me it yet?" Yeah, he just had no effect. It was as if we gave him salt water.
I see.
So I, ran down to the pharmacy. Did you mix things up? And they said no. The guy was completely unresponsive to DMT, and he wasn't extraordinary in any way.
I see. So there's a bell curve in terms of responsiveness that may be unrelated to questions of endogenous DMT production or spiritual attainment.
That could be.
Yeah.
Or I think we're just at the beginning of understanding the endogenous DMT story. So, it could be, it might not be that if you're spiritually advanced, you're less responsive to DMT. There's a story that Tim, which Tim Leary likes to tell about, giving LSD in LA to a Hindu monk, and the Hindu monk was miserable. It was just a bad trip. So it could be that you are less responsive, or you might be as responsive as anyone else.
There's a lot of individual difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's what's really interesting about this, time in academic research, is we're starting to get a handle on the mechanisms of how psychedelics work and the mechanisms of spiritual experience. So I think the confluence of theology and science is going to begin to meet up over spiritual experience as the common common phenomenon that draws both sets of disciplines together.
Of course, there's a field called neurotheology, and I think you coined a term, if I'm correct, theoneurology.
Right. Well, the current reigning paradigm of how the brain is on a spiritual state is called, it's what you could call a bottom-up experience, or bottom-up kind of model. Neurotheology. The neuro part comes first. It's your brain on drugs, or your brain, thinking that it's encountering something divine or spiritual. So I developed a top-down kind of model where God is the originator, and the brain is designed to expedite communication between the divine level and the material level. So that is called theoneurology. Theo comes first.
Yeah. I have heard it said among some researchers that, in fact, psychedelic researchers, that the idea that the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but the brain serves really as a filter to reduce consciousness, because if we were aware of everything, like in cosmic consciousness, we can't function. So the brain blocks this out. And one of the surprising findings I understand from LSD research is that in spite of the intensity of the reported experiences, in some occasions, the brain activity during LSD is rather unremarkable.
I think it'll be worked out. The brain circuitry, and the pharmacology. The current thinking about how psychedelics work is that they modify the default mode network. The idea of the filtering mechanism in the RFA has been supplanted by this notion that the default mode network, which is a state of electrical and metabolic activity of the brain, is modified under the influence of LSD or of psilocybin.
Default mode network.
Default mode network, yeah. That may be the means by which the drugs exert their effects, make you more suggestible and make you more able to manifest or disclose the contents of your mind, which ties in to the information content of either the prophetic or the psychedelic state. Where does that information come from? Does it come from the outside, or is it the result of the divine activating something which is inherent, our own wisdom, our own knowledge? So that was a big debate among the medievalists.
I suspect it's something like a handshake.
I think that's going to be the inevitable conclusion, because you always have a mind and a brain. It's always idiosyncratic. It's not perfect. And there's always going to be an external, source of information which you're able to perceive more or less accurately depending on your capacities, your intellectual and imaginative capacities.
It sort of reminds me of the famous fresco in the Sistine Chapel of God reaching out and touching Adam's hand.
Right. I mean, it's a relationship. Man can't do it all himself. That's hubris.
Yeah.
But God can't do it all himself or herself or itself. It needs, something to interact with in existence. Otherwise, it's just kind of moot.
I suppose in concluding, Rick, that you've explored Buddhism, you've explored Judaism. It suggests to me that your early interest in psychedelics has led to a continual interest in spiritual paths. I get the impression, you're still searching for that.
Yeah, it may have begun in second grade. Like, I was a smartass in second grade. And, the teacher said, if you do that one more time, you're going into the corner. So I did it one more time, and I ended up in the corner, and it was really nice. It was quiet. It was calm. So I thought, this is interesting. Like, 7 years old, right? Yeah. So I've always been interested in altered states, and spirituality encompasses altered states. I like chemistry, but it was the altered state, the spiritual so-called experience, which was the most attractive. Yeah, so I've mostly just researched, and then when I've developed or generated a certain amount of data, see where that leads, and then kind of explore as far as you can, see where it leads next. Like in my Jewish studies, I don't belong to a community. I don't really have an ongoing relationship, with a rabbi. I don't do a lot of prayer. I mostly study and trying to understand what the Bible is saying. So that involves language and philology and grammar. That for me is the best, source of knowledge right now. It has to do with the information content of the spiritual worlds, which is laid down in the Hebrew Bible anyway, in a very culturally compatible manner. I mean, there's stuff to learn every day. If you can inculcate that into people somehow or another, then when people trip, they'll have more to work with. and perhaps get more out of their experiences.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Rick Strassman, thank you once again for being with me and sharing your wealth of knowledge in these things.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's always a pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.